The scent of roasting meat and spilled wine was a thick, cloying blanket in the great hall, but Alara could parse every thread of it. She could smell the nervous sweat of the serving girls, the cloying perfume of the noblewomen, and the sharp, metallic tang of the polished armor on the guards lining the walls. Her world was a tapestry of smells, a silent language she had learned to read with more accuracy than any written word. For the past 5 years, since the curse had stolen her voice and her brother's, it was the only language she had left. From her corner near the kitchens, she watched the throng of bodies celebrating the king's return. King Valerius, the Alpha of Alphas, ruler of the Winterstone Pack and all its territories. His scent was the only one that cut through the miasma of the court, a clean, sharp fragrance of pine and frost that seemed to carry the cold, pure air of the mountains. It called to something deep within her, a primal part of her soul that hummed in. Recognition, a low thrum of a forgotten song. He stood on the dais, a granite figure in a sea of silk and jewels. He was laughing at something one of his commanders said, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. They were the color of a storm-tossed sea, cool and distant, weighed down by a crown she knew he had never wanted. Every woman in the room, from the highest-born lady to the lowliest scullery maid, watched him with a hungry sort of hope. He was their king, their alpha, the ultimate prize. Alara's gaze lingered on him, a dangerous indulgence. She should be focused on her work, on the burning pain in her hands. Beneath the rough-spun wool of her dress, her fingers were a mess of blisters and raw skin, a constant, agonizing reminder of her true purpose. Every night, in the privacy of her tiny attic room, she worked. She worked with the stinging nettles she secretly gathered from the deepest parts of the royal woods, her bare hands crushing their venomous leaves and spinning their fibers into thread. 6 shirts were complete, folded carefully in a locked chest beneath her cot. 1 remained. 1 more shirt to weave, 1 more tapestry of pain to complete before her 7 brothers could be freed from their curse. A sharp nudge to her ribs broke her concentration. Martha, the head cook, gave her a pointed look, her flour-dusted eyebrows knitted in concern. "Stop staring, child. You'll get yourself in trouble." The words were unspoken, but Alara heard them as clearly as if they'd been shouted. She gave a small, apologetic nod and turned her attention back to the stone floor, her safe and familiar domain. Yet, her senses remained fixed on the dais. A new scent coiled into the air, sickly sweet like overripe flowers on the edge of decay. Lady Seraphina. She was gliding towards the king, her crimson dress a slash of color against the hall's gray stone. She carried herself with the predatory grace of a hunting cat, her smile a carefully constructed artifice. She offered the king a goblet of deep red wine, her fingers brushing his as he took it. Valerius accepted the drink with a polite nod, his attention already drifting. He looked bored, a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. Alara felt a strange pang of sympathy for him, this powerful alpha, who seemed so utterly alone. Seraphina's smile tightened at his disinterest. As she turned away, her gaze swept the hall, and, for a horrifying moment, met Alara's. There was no recognition in those cold eyes, only a dismissive glance for a servant. But Alara saw something else. A flicker of dark, greasy magic clinging to Seraphina's aura like a shroud. It was the same magic that had cursed her brothers, the same stench of wrongness and rot. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the dull ache in her hands. Her eyes snapped back to the goblet Valerius held. A faint, oily shimmer coated the surface of the wine, invisible to anyone not attuned to the subtle currents of magic. It was a potion, not a deadly poison. Something cruder would be too obvious. This was a compulsion, a potion to weaken the will, to make an alpha king more suggestible. He was raising the goblet to his lips. Time seemed to slow. The cacophony of the hall faded to a distant hum. All Alara could hear was the frantic pounding of her own heart, a drumbeat of terror. She couldn't shout a warning. She couldn't explain. Her vow of silence was an iron chain on her soul. To break it would be to condemn her brothers forever. But she could not stand by and watch him be ensnared. That scent of pine and frost, the scent of her mate, was a tether she couldn't sever. Mate. The word bloomed in her mind. A shocking, impossible truth. It was a realization that settled in her bones with the weight of absolute certainty. The pull she felt, the hum in her soul, it was the mate bond, dormant but undeniably present. He was hers, and that woman was trying to poison him. She moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. Her body acted on pure, feral instinct. She pushed off the wall, her worn leather shoes slapping against the stone. She stumbled through the crowd, ignoring the indignant gasps and curses. Her target was a young serving boy carrying a heavy tray laden with a flagon of the same wine. She reached him just as he passed the dais. With a cry that was little more than a strangled gasp in her throat, she threw herself forward, pretending to trip over her own feet. Her shoulder slammed into the boy's side. The world tilted. The tray went flying. The flagon of wine arced through the air, a spray of ruby liquid that crashed against the stone steps of the dais, inches from the king's boots. Goblets clattered and rolled. The hall fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Alara lay sprawled on the floor, the rough stone biting into her cheek, the spilled wine soaked into her dress, cold and cloying. She didn't move. She didn't dare. She could feel every eye in the hall fixed on her, a physical weight of judgment and fury. Heavy footsteps approached. A pair of large black leather boots stopped directly in front of her face. The clean scent of pine and frost washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. Get up. The voice was low and resonant, a rumble of thunder that vibrated through the floorboards and into her bones. It was a command, not a request. Slowly, trembling, Alara pushed herself onto her hands and knees, then shakily to her feet. She kept her eyes downcast, her tangled brown hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. She could not look at him. She could not let him see the truth in her eyes. "Look at me," he commanded, the steel in his voice hardening. She couldn't. A whimper escaped her, the only sound she could make. It was a sound of pure terror. A large, calloused hand cupped her chin. The touch was surprisingly gentle, but the strength behind it was absolute. He tilted her head up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were not gray now. They were molten gold, the color of a predator, blazing with a mixture of fury and something else, something she couldn't decipher. Confusion, intrigue. He took in her tear-streaked face, her trembling lips, and then his gaze dropped to her hands. She instinctively tried to pull them back, to hide the raw, weeping skin, but he was too quick. He caught one of her wrists, his grip firm but not painful. He turned her hand over, his thumb brushing over the ruined palm. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. The pain in her hand receded, replaced by a warm, tingling sensation that spread through her entire body. The king's expression shifted, his anger momentarily forgotten, replaced by a deep, unsettling frown. "What is this?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. He looked from her hands back to her eyes, searching for an answer she could not give. From the dais, Lady Seraphina's voice dripped with venomous sweetness. "Your Majesty, she is merely a clumsy kitchen mute. She has ruined the celebration. Have her whipped and thrown out." Valerius didn't look at Seraphina. His golden eyes remained locked on Alara's. He saw the flicker of sheer terror in her gaze when Seraphina spoke. He saw the defiance warring with the fear. He saw a soul trapped behind a wall of silence, and the alpha in him rose to the surface, intrigued and fiercely, inexplicably possessive. He released her hand, the sudden loss of his warmth leaving her cold. "No," he said, his voice ringing with authority that silenced the entire hall. "She will not be whipped." He gestured to Lord Boren, his steward. "Take her from my sight. Clean her up. From tomorrow, she is no longer a kitchen maid." A murmur of shock rippled through the court. "She will be assigned to my personal chambers," the king declared, his gaze still holding Alara captive. "I want to know why a servant would throw herself at the feet of her king." The personal chambers of the Alpha King were a world away from the noise and grime of the kitchens. They were vast and silent, furnished with dark, polished wood and rich tapestries that muffled every sound. A fire crackled in a stone hearth the size of a small carriage, casting flickering shadows across the room. The air was thick with his scent pine, frost, and something uniquely masculine that made Alara's head swim and her knees feel weak. It was everywhere. On the furs thrown over the chairs, in the heavy velvet of the curtains, on the very air she breathed. It was both a comfort and a torment. Lord Boren had left her at the door with a sneer and a warning. "The king is merciful, but his patience is not infinite. Do not test it." The steward's scent was sour, like old paper and suspicion. He did not trust her, and his dislike was a palpable force in the air. Now, she stood frozen just inside the doors, clutching a tray with a silver pitcher of water and a single goblet. Her servant's dress had been replaced with a simple but clean tunic and leggings of soft gray wool. Her hands, cleaned and bandaged by a grim-faced healer, throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. The healer had asked questions, her eyes sharp with professional curiosity about the nature of the wounds. But Alara had only been able to shake her head, her silence, a wall the woman could not breach. Valerius was standing by the large window, his back to her, looking out over the moonlit castle grounds. He was dressed in simple black trousers and a loose white shirt, the trappings of royalty discarded. In the quiet of his chambers, he seemed less like a king and more like a wolf, powerful and contained, a predator in his own den. "Put it on the table," he said without turning around. His voice was softer here, stripped of the booming authority it held in the great hall, but it still sent a shiver down her spine. She moved on silent feet, her heart, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She set the tray down on a small table near the fire. The silver pitcher clinked softly against the wood, the only sound in the room besides the crackling flames. Her task was done. She should retreat, stand by the door until dismissed. That was the protocol. But she couldn't move. She was caught in the orbit of his presence, a moth drawn to a dangerous, beautiful flame. He finally turned, and his eyes found hers across the expanse of the room. The gold had faded, leaving them that cool, stormy gray once more. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and analytical, as if he were trying to piece together a puzzle. "You still haven't found your tongue, I see," he remarked, his tone laced with a dry sort of amusement. Alara dropped her gaze to the floor, a hot flush creeping up her neck. She could feel his approach, the way the air shifted around him. He stopped just a few feet from her. The scent of him was overwhelming now, a clean, wild fragrance that promised safety and danger in equal measure. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "In the hall. That was no accident. I saw your eyes before you fell. You were looking at my goblet." Her head snapped up in alarm. He had seen? He was more observant than she had credited him for. Her mind raced, searching for a way to communicate without words. How could she explain a shimmer of dark magic? How could she accuse a high-born lady like Seraphina without proof, without a voice? They would think her mad. They would call it witchcraft. She took a hesitant step back, shaking her head, trying to convey a denial she did not feel. "No? You weren't looking at my cup?" he pressed, taking a step forward for every one she took back. "Then what were you looking at? Me?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Am I so distracting that I send the kitchen staff tumbling to the floor?" His teasing was a sharp jab, and a spark of her old, pre-cursed defiance flared to life. She stopped retreating and met his gaze, lifting her chin. She gave him a look that she hoped conveyed exactly how unimpressed she was with his royal ego. The smile on his face widened into a genuine grin, transforming his harsh features. For a moment, the burdened king vanished, replaced by a man who looked younger, less weary. The sight stole her breath. "There," he said, his voice soft with satisfaction. "There is a fire in you. I saw it last night. A little mouse with the eyes of a lioness." He closed the remaining distance between them, and her heart hammered against her ribs. He was so close now she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, not for her chin this time, but for her hand. He gently took her bandaged hand in his large, warm palm engulfing hers. "These still trouble me," he said, his expression turning serious again. "The healer said they were burns, but not from fire. She said it was as if you had grasped 1,000 nettles." Elara froze, her blood running cold. He was too close to the truth. She tried to pull her hand away, but his grip tightened, holding her fast. "What are you hiding, little mouse?" he whispered, his gray eyes searching hers. "What secrets do you keep that force you into silence and leave your hands in ruins?" The intensity of his gaze was a physical force, stripping her bare. He saw too much. He felt too much. The mate bond, that invisible thread connecting them, was humming between them, a conduit for more than just physical attraction. He could sense her secrets, even if he couldn't name them. The doors to the chamber opened without a knock, and Lord Boren entered, his face a mask of disapproval. He stopped short upon seeing the king holding the mute servant's hand. "Your Majesty?" Boren said, his voice stiff. "Lady Seraphina is here. She is most insistent on seeing you, to inquire after your well-being, after last night's unfortunate disruption." Valerius dropped Elara's hand as if it had burned him. The warmth vanished, leaving her skin feeling cold and bereft. He turned to face his steward, the mask of the weary king slamming back into place. The brief moment of connection was shattered. "Send her away, Boren," he said, his voice flat. "Sire, that might not be wise. Her father is a powerful ally on the council." "I said, send her away," Valerius snapped, a low growl underpinning his words. The alpha was back, all sharp edges and coiled power. Boren paled and bowed hastily, backing out of the room. Valerius ran a hand through his dark hair, a sigh of frustration escaping him. He turned his back on Elara again, striding back to the window. The wall was back up between them, higher and thicker than before. "You are dismissed," he said, his voice distant. Alara's heart ached. For a fleeting moment, she had felt seen. She had felt a connection that went beyond words, a spark of understanding in the lonely Alpha King. But the world had intruded, as it always did. With a silent curtsy he didn't see, she slipped out of the room, the scent of pine and frost clinging to her like a phantom touch, and the cloying, victorious scent of Serafina waiting just outside the door. The days that followed fell into a strange, tense rhythm. Ilara became a silent shadow in the king's life. She brought his morning meal, laid out his clothes for the day, and stood vigil in his chambers while he attended to the endless meetings that constituted his reign. He rarely spoke to her directly after that first night, yet she felt his eyes on her constantly. When she tidied his desk, she would feel a prickling on the back of her neck and know he was watching her from his chair by the fire. When she drew the curtains against the fading light, she would catch his reflection in the glass, his expression thoughtful and intense. The proximity was a sweet agony. Her soul yearned, reach for him, to soothe the weariness she saw etched around his eyes, to feel the warmth of his hand in hers again. But she was a servant, a mute, a keeper of dangerous secrets. He was her king, and he was her mate. The conflict was a constant storm inside her, a war between duty to her brothers and the desperate, primal call of her own heart. He, too, seemed to be fighting a battle. Some days he was distant and cold, the epitome of the Alpha King, his scent sharp and forbidding. On those days, he barely acknowledged her presence. But on other days, a strange gentleness would surface. He would find excuses to be near her, asking her to mend a tear in his tunic that she knew his valets could handle, or to fetch a book from a high shelf, forcing him to stand close behind her to steady the stool. During those moments, his scent would soften, the frost melting to reveal the earthy warmth of the pines, and his eyes would flash that startling gold. Lady Serafina was a constant, venomous presence at court. She could not get past the guards into Valerius's private chambers, a fact that clearly infuriated her, but she missed no opportunity to corner Ilara in the corridors. "Still playing the loyal dog?" she would hiss, her voice a low mockery. "He'll tire of his little pet soon enough." A king needs a queen, not a mute stray from the kennels. Her scent, that overripe floral decay, would cling to Ilara for hours afterward, making her stomach churn. Ilara knew Serafina was not just a jealous woman. She was a genuine threat. The dark magic Ilara had sensed on her was potent, and it was focused entirely on the king. Serafina was hunting him, and Ilara was, somehow, in her way. The nightly ritual of her weaving became more frantic. Her hands, despite the healer's salves, were a constant source of pain. But the pain focused her, reminding her of what was at stake. 6 shirts were done. The 7th was nearly halfway complete. The thought of her brothers, of their warm laughter and easy camaraderie, was the only thing that kept her going. Soon, she prayed, they would be free. Soon she could speak. And then what? Could she ever tell Valerius the truth? One evening, a week into her new role, the moment she had been dreading arrived. She entered his chambers to turn down his bed and found the room felt wrong. The air was heavy, stagnant, and underneath the familiar scent of pine and frost was another, fainter fragrance. The cloying sweetness of Serafina's magic. Panic seized her. She scanned the room, her eyes darting everywhere. Where was it? What had she done? The room looked the same. The heavy desk, littered with maps and scrolls, the furs on the chair, the weapons rack against the wall. Nothing was out of place. Her gaze fell upon the king's bed. He was not there yet, still in a late-night council meeting. On the bedside table, next to a half-empty glass of water, sat a small, ornate silver locket. It was heart-shaped, intricately carved with vines and thorns. It hadn't been there that morning. She approached it cautiously, as if it were a coiled snake. The closer she got, the stronger the foul magic became. It was a leech, an artifact designed to slowly drain the life force and willpower of whoever was nearest to it. It would make Valerius weak, lethargic, and susceptible to the influence of the one who had planted it, Seraphina. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had to get rid of it. But how? If she was found with it, she would be accused of witchcraft, of attempting to assassinate the king. Her silent defiance in the great hall had already put her under suspicion. This would be a death sentence. She heard footsteps in the corridor. The king was returning. There was no time to think. She snatched the locket from the table. It was cold to the touch, a malevolent, draining cold that seemed to suck the warmth from her very bones. She shoved it deep into the pocket of her tunic just as the door swung open. Valerius entered, looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. He unbuckled his sword belt and let it fall to the floor with a heavy clatter. He didn't seem to notice her, his movements weary and distracted. "The grain reports from the west are disastrous," he muttered, running a hand over his face. "And the eastern lords are rattling their sabers again. It never ends." He walked towards the bed and collapsed onto it, not even bothering to remove his boots. He lay on his back, staring at the canopy, a deep sigh shuddering through his body. Alara stood frozen by the table, the evil cold of the locket pressing against her hip. The oppressive feeling in the room had lessened now that the object was shielded by her body, but she could feel its foul energy trying to latch onto her instead. Valerius turned his head and finally saw her. "Ah, you're still here." His voice was flat, devoid of its usual energy. The locket's proximity had already begun to affect him. She gave a hesitant nod, her mind screaming, "Get it out of here! Get it away from him!" "Good," he said, his eyes fluttering shut. "Stay." The silence. It's peaceful. Her stomach twisted. He wanted her to stay, but her very presence, with the locket in her pocket, was a danger to him. She had to leave. She had to find a way to destroy it. A deep pool, a blacksmith's forge, anything. She took a step towards the door. "Don't go," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. His eyes remained closed, but he reached a hand out, his fingers brushing against her tunic. The casual touch was a brand, setting her skin on fire. Just for a minute. Stay. She was trapped. Trapped by his command, by the call of her mate, and by the cold, evil thing hidden in her pocket. She couldn't protect him by leaving, and she couldn't protect him by staying. For the first time, a wave of true hopelessness washed over her. She was caught in a witch's web, and every move she made seemed only to pull the threads tighter. All she could do was stand there in the firelight, a silent guardian to a king who was slowly being poisoned, with the very instrument of his demise cold against her skin. The locket remained a cold, heavy secret in her pocket for 2 more days. Alara felt its malevolent energy constantly, a subtle drain on her own vitality. She felt tired, her thoughts sluggish, the ever-present pain in her hands amplified to a nearly unbearable degree. But the effect on Valerius was far more pronounced. The vibrant, powerful alpha she knew was fading, replaced by a lethargic and irritable stranger. He slept late, missed council meetings, and snapped at anyone who tried to speak with him. Lord Boren watched him with growing alarm, his suspicious gaze often flicking to Alara, as if he suspected she was the cause. The worst part was that Valerius insisted she remain close. He seemed to find a sliver of comfort in her silent presence, even as the dark magic weakened him. "Don't leave," he'd command in a voice thick with unnatural weariness, and she would be forced to stay, the cursed object meant to destroy him mere inches away. She tried to subtly counteract its influence, focusing her own small, latent light magic, the simple, life-affirming energy she'd inherited from her mother outward, hoping to create a shield around him. It was exhausting, like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. On the third night, the crisis came. Alara was mending one of his cloaks by the fire, her needle moving mechanically, when she heard a choked gasp from the bed. She looked up to see Valerius thrashing, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He was caught in a fever dream, his hands clenched in the furs. "No," he muttered, his voice ragged. "The forest. It's dying. So cold." She rushed to his side, her sewing forgotten. She touched his forehead. He was burning with fever. His breathing was shallow, his pulse thready beneath her fingertips. The locket's influence had reached its peak. It was killing him. Desperation clawed at her throat. The physicians would be useless. They couldn't fight magic. Serafina had won. Valerius would die, or become so weakened he would be her puppet, and Alara would have failed the one person her soul recognized as its other half. No, the word was a silent roar in her mind. She would not let this happen. She looked from his pained face to the lump in her pocket. She had to destroy the locket, but she couldn't leave him like this. He might not be alive when she returned. Her duty to her brothers, her vow, it all seemed secondary to the life of the man fading before her eyes. A desperate idea took root. Her magic was small, untrained, a magic of light and life, the opposite of the death magic, clinging to the locket. Perhaps she could disrupt the enchantment, just for a little while, long enough to give him a fighting chance. She pulled the cursed object from her pocket. In the firelight, the silver seemed to writhe, the carved thorns looking sharp and cruel. It pulsed with a cold, dark energy that made her teeth ache. She placed her other hand on Valerius's chest, feeling the faint, struggling beat of his heart. She closed her eyes, shutting out the world, shutting out her fear. She reached deep inside herself, past the pain and the silence, searching for the tiny spark of light she had always hidden there. She nurtured it, fed it with her will, with her desperate, unspoken love for the man under her hand. "Live," she pleaded with every fiber of her being. "Please, live." A faint warmth grew in her palm. She focused it, drawing it up her arm and into the hand that held the locket. A soft golden glow, no brighter than a candle flame, enveloped her fingers. She poured all of her energy, all of her hope, into that light, pushing it against the locket's oppressive cold. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a faint crackling sound, the locket grew hot, searing her skin. The dark energy recoiled from her light, the enchantment fracturing. It wasn't broken, but it was disrupted, its hold on Valerius momentarily severed. At the same instant, Valerius's eyes flew open. They were no longer gray or gold, but wide with disorientation. His gaze locked on her, on the faint golden light surrounding her hand. He saw her face, contorted in concentration and pain, and a flicker of understanding, of awe, crossed his features. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, the first clean breath he'd taken in days. "You," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The spell was broken. The connection between the locket and the king was temporarily severed. Now was her chance. Without a second thought, she turned and fled. She couldn't stay and explain. She had been seen using magic. She had the locket. It was all the proof they would need to condemn her. She ran from the king's chambers, clutching the now scorching piece of silver in her hand, her heart breaking with every step that took her further away from him. Valerius pushed himself up on his elbows, the world slowly coming back into focus. The oppressive weight that had been crushing him for days was gone. The fog in his mind had lifted. He felt weak, drained, but he felt like himself again. He remembered a flash of gold. He remembered the face of his silent servant, filled with a fierce, protective light. He remembered the feeling of a dark influence being ripped away. She hadn't been harming him. She had been saving him. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The quiet pull he had felt towards her, the strange sense of peace in her presence, the inexplicable possessiveness, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth: mate. The bond, which had been a quiet hum beneath the surface of his consciousness, roared to life, a blazing inferno of certainty. She was his, the mute girl, the little mouse with the lioness eyes. She was his mate, and she had just saved his life, and she was gone. "Guard!" he roared, his voice still weak but filled with the unshakable power of an alpha king. 2 guards burst into the room, their swords drawn. "Find her!" Valerius commanded, swinging his legs off the bed, his body trembling with urgency. "Find the girl, Alara." It was the first time he had used her name, a name he had learned from the steward's rosters and had kept tucked away in his mind. "Find her and bring her to me. She is not to be harmed. Do you understand? No one is to lay a hand on her." Lord Boren appeared in the doorway, his face pale with shock at the king's sudden recovery. "Your Majesty, what is happening?" "The mute girl was seen fleeing your chambers. I have men searching for her now. She is a witch, a traitor." "She is no traitor," Valerius snarled, rising to his full height. The strength was already flowing back into his limbs. "You will call off your men, Boren. She is under my protection. I want her found and brought to me safely. Now." Boren stared, dumbfounded by the king's fierce defense of a servant girl. But he saw the look in Valerius's eyes, the pure, undiluted power of an alpha protecting what was his, and he bowed his head in submission. "As you command, Your Majesty." But it was too late. As Boren hurried to relay the king's new orders, a different contingent of the castle guard, acting on the steward's previous command, was already closing in on a small, fleeing figure near the castle's forge, the damning evidence of a silver locket clutched in her hand. The dungeon was cold and damp, a place where hope went to die. The air tasted of mildew and despair. Water dripped from the stone ceiling in a slow, maddening rhythm, each drop echoing the ticking clock of Alara's life. They had found her by the old forge, her hand raised to throw the locket into the roaring flames. They had twisted her arm behind her back, the cursed silver clattering to the ground, and dragged her away before she could complete the act. Now she sat on a pile of damp straw, her simple gray tunic torn and stained. Iron manacles, cold and heavy, chafed her wrists. The locket had been taken as evidence. Lord Boren had presided over the interrogation, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He'd held up the locket. "You were trying to bewitch the king. Confess your treason." He had demanded answers she could not give, her silence taken as proof of her guilt. Lady Seraphina had swept in like a vulture, a vision of feigned concern. She had testified before the council, her voice trembling with crocodile tears, how she had gifted the locket to the king. as a ward for his protection. She claimed the mute servant must have stolen it and cursed it with dark kitchen magic, jealous of the king's favor. It was a perfect, diabolical lie. Ilara, the silent, strange girl with the ruined hands and no allies, was the perfect scapegoat. The sentence was passed swiftly: execution for high treason and witchcraft. At sunrise, 2 days hence. A hollow ache filled Ilara's chest, so vast and empty, it felt as if her heart had been carved out. It wasn't her own impending death that tormented her. It was the thought of her brothers, so close to freedom, now condemned to remain as stags forever. It was the thought of Valerius, free from the locket's immediate influence, but now trapped in Seraphina's web of lies. He would be bound to the very woman who had tried to enslave him. The cell door creaked open, and a sympathetic-looking young guard set a bowl of thin gruel and a cup of water on the floor. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "The king, he seems better," the guard offered, his voice low. "But the council is convinced. They announced the betrothal this morning, to Lady Seraphina. To secure the kingdom and show a united front against dark magic." The words struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. Betrothed. It was done. The final thread of hope she hadn't even realized she was clinging to, the hope that Valerius would somehow know the truth, that he would save her, snapped. Of course he wouldn't. He was a king. He had a kingdom to run. He couldn't defy his entire council for a mute servant girl, no matter what he might have felt in a fleeting moment. The mate bond meant nothing against a crown. The guard left, the heavy door booming shut, plunging her back into darkness and despair. All was lost. Her life, her brothers, her mate. Seraphina had won everything. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in a sea of grief. Hours bled into one another. Eventually, she heard a soft scratching at the door. It wasn't the guard. The slot at the bottom of the door slid open, and a familiar, flour-dusted hand pushed a bundle through. Martha. Ilara scrambled across the floor. It was a bundle of rough spun cloth. She unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside was the final, unfinished shirt, and tucked within its folds was a small, tightly wrapped parcel of crushed, dried nettle leaves and a spindle. Her loyal friend had risked everything. A new fire ignited in the ashes of her despair. It wasn't hope. It was pure, unadulterated rage. Rage at the curse, at Seraphina, at her own powerlessness. They would take her life, but she would not go to her death leaving her work unfinished. She would not let her brother's last chance die with her in this cell, and she would not let Valerius marry that monster. A desperate, insane plan began to form in her mind. She had 2 days. The execution would be public, in the main courtyard. The entire court would be there. The king would be there. She would finish the shirt. She would find a way to get it to her brothers. And at the execution block, with her last moments on this earth, she would break her vow. She would speak. She would scream the truth for all to hear. It would be too late to save herself. And it might not even save her brothers if the curse's magic held true, but she would not let Seraphina win in silence. She would expose her. She would give Valerius the truth, even if it was her final act. Her fingers, raw and bleeding inside the loose bandages, found the spindle and the nettle fibers. The manacles were clumsy, but she could work around them. Pain shot up her arms as she began to spin the thread, but she welcomed it. It was a familiar pain, a purposeful pain. It was the pain of sacrifice, of love, of defiance. In the cold, damp darkness of the dungeon, Ilara began to weave. She wove her grief and her rage into the stinging threads. She wove the memory of her brother's laughter and the scent of pine and winter frost. She wove a shroud for her enemies and a final desperate prayer for the king she loved. She had nothing left to lose, and that gave her a terrifying kind of freedom. The sun would rise on her execution day, but she would not meet it as a victim. She would meet it as a storm. The morning of the execution dawned gray and cold. A damp mist clung to the castle stones, muffling sound and chilling the air. Alara had not slept. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but her mind was sharp, honed to a razor's edge by determination. The 7th shirt was finished. It lay beside her on the straw, a rough, greenish-gray garment that hummed with a faint, latent power. It was the culmination of 5 years of pain and silence, her life's work distilled into a single piece of cloth. Martha had come one last time in the dead of night. Through a series of frantic gestures and the few words Alara could scratch into the dirt floor with a loose stone, a plan was made. Martha had taken the other 6 shirts, her face grim with resolve. She would go to the edge of the royal woods, to the clearing where the 7 stags were often seen, a place Alara had described in her crude drawings. It was a wild, desperate hope that the stags would be there, that they would somehow understand. The guards came for her shortly after sunrise. They removed the manacles, only to bind her hands tightly in front of her with a coarse rope. The young, sympathetic guard from before was among them, and he refused to meet her eyes, his face pale and strained. They led her from the dungeon, up winding stone staircases, and into the biting morning air of the central courtyard. A large, grim-looking platform had been erected, a heavy wooden block at its center. A hulking executioner, clad in black leather and leaning on a massive, gleaming axe, stood waiting. The courtyard was packed. It seemed the entire city had turned out to witness the death of the royal witch. They were a sea of hostile, curious faces, their collective scent a foul mixture of fear, sweat, and morbid excitement. They jeered and spat as she was forced through the crowd, their insults washing over her. She kept her head high, her gaze fixed on the platform. She would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. On a raised dais to the side of the platform sat the royal court. Lord Boren was there, his expression stern and unyielding, and next to him, dressed in a gown of shimmering black that seemed to mock the occasion, was Lady Seraphina. She watched Ilara's approach with a triumphant reptilian smile, her victory complete, and then Alara saw him. Valerius sat on a throne-like chair, his face a mask of stone. He was dressed in the full regalia of his office, the crown heavy on his brow. He looked every bit the powerful Alpha King, remote and untouchable, but his eyes were a maelstrom of raw agony. As her gaze met his across the courtyard, she saw the mask crack. She saw the torment, the conflict, the desperate helplessness of a wolf caught in a trap. He knew. In his heart, he knew she was innocent, but he was bound by his law, by his counsel, by the safety of his kingdom. Their eyes held for a long, breathless moment, a silent, heartbreaking conversation passing between them. "I'm sorry," his gaze seemed to say. "Don't be," hers replied. "Just know the truth." She was forced up the steps of the platform and pushed to her knees before the block. The priest began to drone on about her sins, his words a meaningless buzz in her ears. She tuned him out, her senses stretching, searching. She listened for the sound of hooves, for the cry of a familiar voice. She smelled the air for the wild, earthy scent of her brothers. Nothing. A cold dread began to seep into her resolve. Had Martha failed? Were her brothers lost, unaware of her fate? Had it all been for nothing? The priest finished his prayer. The executioner stepped forward, testing the edge of his axe with a calloused thumb. The crowd fell into a hushed, anticipatory silence. This was it, her last moment. She had to speak now. She drew in a deep breath, preparing to shatter 5 years of silence, to scream his name and Seraphina's treachery to the heavens. And then she heard it, a sound from the edge of the crowd, a commotion, a gasp of surprise that rippled through the onlookers. Then a roar, not of a man, but of a great beast. The crowd parted, people screaming and scrambling to get away, as something immense burst into the courtyard. It was a stag, the largest she had ever seen, his antlers a magnificent crown of bone, his eyes burning with intelligent fury. He was not alone. Behind him came 6 others, equally majestic, their powerful hooves striking sparks on the cobblestones. Her brothers, they had come. They weren't wearing the shirts. Martha must have found them, but how could she get the shirts onto them? The stags were wild, powerful creatures. But then she saw Martha, her skirts hiked up, running behind them, her arms laden with the nettle shirts. The lead stag, her eldest brother Ronan, lowered his head, allowing Martha to throw the rough garment over his neck. A blinding flash of golden light erupted from him, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. When the light faded, a man stood where the stag had been, tall and broad-shouldered, with the same fiery red hair he'd had 5 years ago. He was naked save for the rough shirt, but he stood with the bearing of a prince. One by one, Martha threw the shirts, and one by one, the stags were transformed, the courtyard filling with flashes of brilliant light. 7 princes stood in the center of the square, their eyes all fixed on the platform, on their sister. The crowd was in an uproar, a chaotic mix of terror and awe. Seraphina had risen from her seat, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Valerius was on his feet, his eyes wide, staring at the impossible scene before him. Alara didn't hesitate. This was her chance. With a surge of adrenaline, she snapped the ropes binding her wrists. The fibers, weakened by her frantic weaving in the cell, gave way. She snatched the 7th shirt from a hidden fold in her tunic where she had secreted it. Before anyone could react, she ran to the edge of the platform and leaped. She landed hard but rolled to her feet, ignoring the jarring impact. She ran towards the one remaining stag, her youngest brother, Finn, who was circling nervously. Finn! Her voice, raw and unused, cracked in the cold air, but it was her voice. The vow was broken. The word was out. A searing pain, like a hot poker, lanced through her throat, but she ignored it. She threw the final shirt over her brother's head. Another flash of light, and her little brother stood before her, his eyes full of tears. Alara turned to face the dais. She pointed a trembling finger at the horrified witch. She did it, Alara cried, her voice growing stronger with every word, fueled by years of repressed fury. Lady Seraphina! She cursed my brothers. She tried to poison the king with that locket. She is the traitor. She is the witch. All hell broke loose. Her brothers, now understanding everything, let out enraged roars and started towards the dais. The guards, confused, drew their swords, unsure of who to defend. The crowd surged back and forth in a panicked wave. Seraphina's composure finally shattered. Her face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. Lies! The little mute is mad. She raised her hands, and a sickly green energy began to gather around her fingertips. She was going to attack. Her target was clear, Valerius. If she couldn't have him, no one would. But Valerius was already moving. He vaulted over the railing of the dais, landing on the cobblestones with a predator's grace. He moved with a speed that was utterly inhuman, a blur of black and silver. He reached Serafina just as she unleashed a bolt of crackling green energy. He shoved her hard, sending her stumbling sideways. The bolt of magic went wide, striking the stone wall of the castle and leaving a blackened, smoking crater. "Seize her!" Lord Boren bellowed from the dais, his face pale but his voice resolute. He had seen the proof he needed. He had seen the truth. The royal guards, their confusion vanishing at a clear command, swarmed the witch. She spat and cursed, trying to summon another spell, but they were too quick. One of them slapped a heavy iron manacle on her wrist. Her magic fizzled out, suppressed by the cold iron. Her power was gone. She was just a woman, screaming impotently as she was dragged away. The courtyard fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the whimpering of the defeated witch and the heavy breathing of the 7 princes. And in the center of it all, Valerius turned. He ignored the princes, the guards, the gaping crowd. His eyes, now a blazing pure gold, found Alara. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. The world seemed to fade away, the noise and chaos receding until it was just the two of them, standing in the heart of the storm. He stopped in front of her, his gaze drinking her in, as if he were seeing her for the first time. He reached up and cupped her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure life that chased away the last of the dungeon's chill. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew. I felt it. I was a fool, trapped by my own laws. I had to," she whispered, tears finally streaming down her face. "I couldn't let her have you. She was never going to have me," he growled, a possessive primal sound. "There has only ever been you. From the moment you fell at my feet, there has only been you." He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was fierce, desperate, acclaiming. It was 5 years of silence, and a lifetime of yearning poured into a single, breathtaking moment. It was the taste of pine and frost, the promise of forever. The crowd gasped, but Alara heard nothing but the roar of blood in her ears and the frantic, joyful beat of her own heart. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. He looked deep into her eyes, and she saw a raw vulnerability there she had never seen before. "Don't look away from me," the Alpha King whispered to his scared Omega. "You're safe now." Then before the entire court, before her brothers and his people, he lowered his head to the curve of her neck. She felt the sharp prick of his canines against her skin, a moment of brief, searing pain that was instantly replaced by a wave of pure bliss, of rightness, of coming home. The mate bond, once a fragile thread, snapped into place, a permanent, unbreakable chain of silver and gold, forged in magic and sealed in love. The crowd, which had moments ago been calling for her blood, erupted into a deafening cheer for their new queen. The aftermath was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Ilara's brothers, the lost princes of the northern kingdom of Silverwood, were quickly given quarters in the castle, their sudden reappearance sending shockwaves through the political landscape. Lord Boren, his face etched with a deep and profound shame for his part in Ilara's condemnation, became her most steadfast administrator, working tirelessly to manage the torrent of inquiries and arrangements that her revelation had caused. Serafina, stripped of her titles and lands, was confined to the deepest cell in the dungeon, the iron manacles a permanent fixture. Her days now to be spent mucking out the castle, stables under heavy guard, a punishment Valerius himself had decreed as fitting for someone who had treated others like animals. In the midst of it all, Alara found a strange new center in Valerius. He refused to let her out of his sight. He had moved her into the queen's chambers, a suite of rooms adjoining his own that had been empty since his mother's passing, but he rarely let her stay in them. More often than not, she would wake in his bed, wrapped in his arms, his steady breathing, a comforting presence in the dark. The bond between them was a living thing, a constant current of emotion and sensation that flowed back and forth. She could feel his weariness after a long day of council meetings, and he could feel her anxiety when faced with a gaggle of bowing ladies in waiting. It was overwhelming, this new life. She was no longer Alara the mute servant, but Princess Alara of Silverwood, the future queen of Winterstone, the king's fated mate. The titles felt like ill-fitting clothes, heavy and awkward. The girl who had spent 5 years with her head down, communicating only with her eyes, was now expected to speak, to command, to rule. Her voice was still rough, and her throat ached if she spoke for too long, a physical reminder of the curse's lingering shadow. She preferred the quiet moments with Valerius, when words weren't necessary. They would sit by the fire in his chambers, her head on his shoulder, his hand gently tracing patterns on her arm, the silence between them, more intimate than any conversation. One evening, about a week after the execution that wasn't, her brothers joined them for a private dinner. It was the first time they had all been together in a relaxed setting. Ronan, her eldest brother, was a natural leader, already discussing trade routes and border alliances with Valerius. The others were slowly readjusting to their human forms, still marveling at the dexterity of their hands and the taste of cooked food. Finn, her youngest brother, was the most affected. He stayed close to Alara's side, his eyes still holding a haunted, animalistic watchfulness. He watched the way Valerius looked at his sister, his expression a mixture of gratitude and fierce, protective suspicion. "He marked you," Finn said quietly, when Valerius was distracted by a map Ronan had unrolled. Finn's gaze was fixed on the faint, silvery scar on Alara's neck. Alara touched the mark, the skin still sensitive. "He is my mate, Finn. It is their way. He is a wolf," Finn stated, not with malice, but with the simple observation of a man who had spent 5 years as a prey animal. "And you are of the forest. Be careful, Alara. His world is not ours. His world is my world now," she replied softly, her gaze drifting to Valerius. He looked up then, as if sensing her thoughts, and gave her a small, private smile that made her heart ache. "And mine is his." Later that night, after her brothers had departed, Valerius found her standing on the balcony of his chambers, staring up at the full moon. The night air was cold, but she didn't feel it. The bond with him was a permanent warmth in her veins. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his scent of pine and frost a comforting blanket. "Your brother does not trust me," he murmured into her hair. "Finn does not trust anyone," she replied. "He was the youngest, the most frightened. He will learn. He sees how you look at me." "And how do I look? At you?" She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his jaw. She looked into his eyes, the color of a calm sea in the moonlight. "You look at me like I am the only thing you have ever been sure of." A muscle feathered in his cheek. "That is because you are," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he still struggled to express. "Alara, for years I have been a king, an alpha, a symbol. I have been surrounded by people, but I have been utterly alone. I never understood what was missing until I saw you. Even in your silence, you were the loudest thing in my world. I was so afraid, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Afraid of what you would do if you knew the truth. Afraid of what Serafina would do. But mostly, I was afraid of this feeling, this pull. I thought it was a weakness. It is our greatest strength, he said, leaning down to kiss her. This kiss was different from the one in the courtyard. It was slow, tender, a question and an answer all at once. It spoke of shared burdens and future promises. I almost lost you, he whispered against her lips. I stood on that dais and watched them prepare to take your life, and I felt my own soul preparing to die with you. I will never feel that helpless again. I will never let anyone harm you again. You are my queen, Ilara, my mate, my everything. The conviction in his voice washed away the last of her fears, the final lingering shadows of the dungeon. The warnings of her brother, born of love and fear, faded in the face of the absolute certainty of the man holding her. He was a wolf. Yes, he was a king, but he was hers. And she, the silent weaver who had once been invisible, was his. 1 month later, the first snows of winter began to fall, blanketing the capital in a layer of pristine white. From the balcony of the queen's chambers, Ilara watched the delicate flakes drift down, each one a tiny, perfect crystal. A heavy fur cloak was wrapped around her shoulders, and a warm, solid body was pressed against her back. You're thinking again, Valerius murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. I can feel it. It's very loud, she smiled, leaning her head back against his shoulder. I was just thinking that a month ago, I was in a dungeon waiting to die. And now I am watching the first snow with my husband. They had been married a week prior, in a ceremony that joined not only 2 people, but 2 kingdoms. Her brothers, standing as her honor guard, had formally pledged the allegiance of the newly restored Silverwood to the Winterstone Pact, creating an alliance that would ensure peace for generations. The people, who had once jeered her, now showered her with flowers, their cheers for the Weaver Queen echoing through the city. Some things change for the better, Valerius said, his arms tightening around her. He pressed a soft kiss to the silvery bite mark on her neck, a gesture that was both possessive and tender, although, he added, a playful growl in his voice, I do occasionally miss the peace and quiet. You have a surprising number of opinions for someone who was silent for 5 years. Ilara laughed, turning in his arms to face him. She playfully swatted his chest. Be careful what you wish for, Your Majesty. I have 5 years of conversation saved up. We've barely gotten through the first month. I suppose I can endure it, he said, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, sparkling with amusement and a deep, abiding love. He brushed a stray snowflake from her hair, his touch infinitely gentle. Seeing you like this, happy, safe, hearing your voice, your laughter, it's a better sound than any royal fanfare. Her smile softened. My hands have healed, she said, holding them up for him to see. The skin was smooth and unblemished, the raw nettle-stung flesh a distant memory. I haven't touched a spindle or a loom since that day. You never have, to again, unless you wish it, he said seriously. Your weaving saved your brothers. It saved me. But that part of your life is over. The pain is over. She reached up, her now healed fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. It wasn't all pain. It taught me to listen, to see what others miss. It made me who I am. And who you are, he whispered, lowering his head until their foreheads touched, is the bravest, most stubborn, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You are the heart of my kingdom and the soul of my life. The world outside was cold and white, but in his arms, Ilara was warm. She was home. The silent girl from the kitchens, the cursed princess, the condemned witch, they were all parts of her past. Now, she was a queen, a mate, a wife. She lifted her face to his, her heart full to bursting. I love you, Valerius, she said, the words coming easily now, as natural as breathing. And I love you, my weaver queen, he replied just before. His lips captured hers, sealing their promise as the snow continued to fall, covering the old world and heralding the beginning of their new one.